London in December 1914 was cloaked in a heavy fog that wrapped the streets in silence and shadow. The gas lamps flickered weakly, their light barely cutting through the dense haze, making even familiar alleys seem strange and foreboding. The city felt suspended between night and an unnatural stillness, as though it were holding its breath for something unseen. Shadows lengthened along the cobblestones, twisting like fingers around corners and doorways, and every creak of a shutter or distant footstep seemed magnified, echoing through the deserted streets. The narrow lanes of the East End, usually alive with children's laughter and the chatter of neighbors, were now empty, haunted by a quiet unease that settled deep in the bones of anyone who dared walk them alone. People whispered of a child whose life had ended abruptly, a girl whose presence now lingered in ways that defied explanation. Her name traveled slowly from house to house, first in fear, then in fascination, until everyone knew of the murdered child whose voice, they claimed, could still be heard in the dead of night. The story spread with a chilling momentum, each retelling adding a layer of suspense and dread as witnesses described soft singing, drifting from empty streets or shadowed windows. At first, it was a faint melody, almost delicate, a tune that seemed impossibly innocent against the dark backdrop of the city, but soon the notes took on a haunting quality, curling around the minds of those who listened and refusing to let them rest. The Coffin, a simple wooden box, rested in a church crypt near the Old District, yet tales emerged that her song traveled beyond the confines of stone and earth. Locals claimed that when the wind blew just so, carrying the chill of the Thames through the alleyways, the girl's humming could be heard, a sound that made even the most skeptical pause and shiver. Old men, hardened by years and misfortune, swore they felt a presence near the crypt, a slight movement in the shadows, a whisper that seemed to press against their ears even when the streets were empty. The song was described as macabre yet tender, a haunting echo of innocence stolen too soon, and those who heard it reported an unshakable mixture of sorrow and fear. Children stopped playing outdoors, their games silenced by the stories of the singing child, and parents kept windows shuttered and doors bolted long before nightfall. Candles burned late into the night in houses along the streets, the flickering flames casting trembling shadows that seemed to respond to the distant melody. Every creaking floorboard, every sigh of wind through the narrow streets, became proof for the fearful that the child had not departed, that she lingered still, tied to the city by something beyond comprehension. The police, at first dismissive, began to receive complaints of singing in empty neighborhoods, footsteps echoing with no source, and fleeting glimpses of a small figure near the churchyard walls. Londoners whispered of a cursed presence, of a tragedy so dark that it had left a permanent mark on the air itself. The song became a nightly ritual for those who could not sleep, a chilling accompaniment to the fog and the distant tolling of church bells, reminding all who listened that death had not ended the child's story. Even the clergy reported a strange unease during evening services, a weight in the air that made prayers tremble on their lips, as if the dead girl's voice threaded through the sanctuary with invisible fingers. The fog seemed to carry her melody, wrapping it around lampposts, cobblestones, and doorways, embedding the haunting sound into the consciousness of the living. The haunting drew neighbors together in hushed conversation, sharing sightings, sounds, and unease, yet no one could explain how the voice continued, or why it insisted on lingering in the city's winter nights. As the days passed, the city's collective anxiety grew, every shadow a potential manifestation of the child's presence, every gust of wind a note in her mournful song. London's December of 1914 became a tapestry of fear, superstition, and whispered horror, stitched together by the memory and presence of a child whose voice refused to fade, whose coffin held more than a body, but an echo that would haunt the streets indefinitely. The streets of London grew colder as night deepened, and with each hour the fog thickened, swallowing the city in a ghostly haze. The singing, now more distinct, wound through narrow alleys and past shuttered windows, carrying with it an eerie intimacy that made every listener feel as though the child were standing just behind them. Whispers of her melody spread beyond the immediate neighborhood, reaching the attention of those who had previously dismissed the tales as superstition. Some claimed the voice shifted, sometimes near the river, where the fog mingled with the smell of the Thames, sometimes from rooftops, drifting down to mingle with the ordinary sounds of the sleeping city. Everyone who heard it reported the same mixture of awe and terror, an involuntary fascination that demanded attention yet filled the mind with unease. The child's death had been sudden, violent, and shrouded in mystery. And now that mystery seemed to have taken on a life of its own, manifesting in a voice that refused to be silenced. The crypt where she rested became a site of both reverence and fear, locals leaving small tokens at its threshold, candles burning late into the night, prayers whispered into the darkness in the hope of appeasing whatever lingered within and beyond the stone walls. People spoke of glimpses of shadows moving with purpose, always just beyond vision, shapes that dissolved when approached, leaving only the faintest chill and the echo of a song that would not end. The story of the singing child became a legend that clung to the city, a caution whispered to every passerby, a haunting refrain that merged with the winter wind and the creaking timbers of London's ancient buildings. Even those far from the East End felt the presence in subtle ways. A passing note on the street, a door left slightly ajar, a candle flickering inexplicably seemed to hint at the child's unseen audience, as though she watched over every corner, a tragic and macabre reminder of innocence lost. The authorities documented reports, though few dared to investigate in person, and those who did came back shaken, claiming a weight in the air, a feeling of being observed and always. The faint, lingering melody that seemed to reach into their very minds. Every night, as the gas lamp sputtered and the fog shifted, the city became a stage for the unseen, the tragic child's voice weaving a tapestry of dread and fascination that would not loosen its grip. Londoners began to understand that this was no ordinary haunting. The child's presence had intertwined with the city's very soul, a permanent mark etched into the fog, the stones, and the shadows. A chilling balance of sorrow and fear gripped the streets, a reminder that the violence that had ended her life had not concluded her influence, that in death, the child's voice had gained a terrifying permanence. The foggy nights carried the story forward, each note in the song a stitch in the tapestry of horror and fascination, binding together past and present, life and death, innocence and tragedy. Everyone who listened could feel it, a strange awareness that something pure yet tragic had refused to vanish, leaving behind a resonance that unsettled the living while preserving the memory of the lost. Childhood in the neighborhood became forever tinged with caution and superstition, every creaking floorboard and shifting shadow a potential sign that the singing child lingered. And the legend grew with each retelling, deeper, darker, more impossible to forget. London's fog, the distant toll of church bells, the low hum of unseen footsteps, all became accompaniments to the haunting melody, binding the city and the child's story into a single, macabre memory that refused to fade. Those who dared to speak of it in daylight were met with knowing nods or fearful glances, each person aware that the child's influence had seeped into every corner of the city, a tragic echo that would persist beyond her mortal existence. The December nights of 1914 became synonymous with her voice, the streets a haunted symphony of whispers, shadows, and a presence both sorrowful and terrifying. The singing child, though gone in body, had left a mark that would haunt London indefinitely, a chilling reminder that some tragedies are too profound to end, their echoes persisting like a song carried endlessly by the winter wind. The year was 1914. A time when London was on the brink of chaos, with the shadow of war looming over Europe and the city itself teeming with tension and uncertainty. The East End, where the tragedy of the singing child had unfolded, was a labyrinth of narrow streets, crowded tenements, and dimly lit alleys that seemed to absorb the fog and the secrets it carried. Families lived in close quarters, the walls of their homes thin enough to carry whispers and faint sounds from one room to another, and the sounds of the city, footsteps, carts, distant shouts intermingled with the low murmur of everyday life. Yet even in this bustling neighborhood, a dark silence had begun to settle in the wake of the child's death. Those who had known the girl described her as unusually bright, curious and delicate, with eyes that seemed far older than her years. She had lived with her parents in a modest row house near a small neglected square, and her life had been ordinary in every sense, until the day it ended. Her death was sudden, a mysterious and violent act that no one could fully explain. Rumors swirled immediately, some blaming strangers, others whispering of internal family disputes, but the truth remained elusive. The community, tight-knit and wary, had no answers, only fear and a growing sense that the ordinary order of life had been broken. Local newspapers covered the case briefly with sparse details and no clear leads, fueling speculation and a deep unease that spread through every household. The girl's funeral had been small but solemn, attended mostly by family and neighbors. Yet even in the daylight, a pall seemed to hang over the streets. Reports emerged of a faint humming or singing during the service, though no one could pinpoint its source. Some believed it was the child herself, her voice lingering beyond the grave. Others thought it the wind through the cracked church windows, carrying echoes that were interpreted by the grieving as a supernatural presence. Regardless, the impression on the residents was profound. The child's death had become more than a personal tragedy. It was now a mark on the collective consciousness of the neighborhood, a shadow that would touch every life in subtle, unsettling ways as the city moved forward. The larger context of 1914 could not be ignored. London was filled with anxieties about the war across the Channel. Rationing and shortages began creeping into daily life, and newspapers were filled with tales of battles and losses overseas. Against this backdrop, the mysterious death of a child within the city seemed even more jarring, a reminder that violence and tragedy were not confined to distant lands, but could reach even the most ordinary streets. The East End, historically resilient and proud, now found itself shaken to its core, with families and neighbors watching one another warily, unsure who could be trusted or what threats might linger unseen. Each alley and street corner seemed alive with possibility, with shadows that might conceal someone dangerous or merely the imagination run wild in grief and fear. The child's home, modest and unremarkable before, became a locus of stories, speculation, and cautious observation, and every neighbor who had glimpsed her life felt a mix of guilt, sorrow, and helpless fascination. While authorities continued their investigation, no clear suspect emerged. Detectives noted inconsistencies in witness statements, a lack of physical evidence, and conflicting accounts of the day the child had disappeared. Each clue seemed to dissolve upon closer inspection, leaving only fragments of a narrative that refused to cohere. In the meantime, the residents were left with whispers, rumors, and an ever-growing unease, feeling that something beyond their understanding had intruded into their lives. The child's presence, or perhaps the memory of her, seemed to inhabit the streets themselves. At night, the narrow lanes echoed with unplaceable sounds, soft singing, distant footsteps, a faint rustling in the fog, and many swore they could see a small figure moving just at the edge of vision. It was unclear whether these were manifestations of collective grief, imagination, or something more. Regardless, the effect on the community was undeniable, altering their daily routines, their sleep, and their sense of security. Economic and social conditions in the East End further complicated the neighborhood's response. Families lived close together, poverty and overcrowding were common, and children often played unsupervised in the streets. The sudden death of one child, then the whispers of supernatural sounds made every parent hyper-vigilant, every household uneasy. Shops and markets carried the weight of these tensions as conversations lingered on the tragedy, blending with news of political instability and the distant drums of war. The city's industrial hum seemed to dim in places near the girl's home, replaced by a silence that made every passing sound more ominous. Community gatherings, once common, grew smaller and more hesitant as people avoided spaces where they might confront the inexplicable. Each passing day reinforced the notion that the child's death was not simply a singular event, but a catalyst for an enduring unease that would color their perception of the entire neighborhood. The church itself became a place of quiet fascination and fear. Parishioners noted that the choir, even during daylight rehearsals, sometimes faltered or shivered inexplicably, as if some unseen force had entered the building. Candle flames flickered without reason, shadows shifted oddly, and small notes of a song that no one was singing were occasionally reported, vanishing as suddenly as they appeared. The crypt, where the child had been laid to rest, was now both a sanctuary and a locus of dread, attracting visitors, mourners, and those drawn by curiosity or superstition. Each story, each reported sound, added to a growing mythology that intertwined with the daily lives of those who lived nearby, embedding itself into memory and rumor with an almost deliberate persistence. The investigation into the child's death seemed to yield nothing but more questions and a growing sense of unease among the residents. Detectives scoured the narrow streets, interrogated neighbors, and examined the modest home for any clue. Yet every lead dissolved into confusion or contradiction. Witnesses reported seeing fleeting figures, shadows that did not belong, and in some cases heard faint humming or a delicate melody that seemed impossibly soft and yet painfully clear. Even those trained to remain logical and rational found themselves unsettled by the unexplainable occurrences. Each account, though dismissed by some, collectively built a narrative that the child's presence, or perhaps her memory, lingered in ways that could not be quantified. Parents of nearby children became increasingly protective, keeping their children indoors, shuttering windows, and avoiding the streets after dusk. Schools reported heightened anxiety among pupils, many of whom had known the girl or heard the stories from siblings and neighbors. Teachers tried to maintain order, but whispers of the singing child drifted through classrooms like a persistent wind, making concentration difficult and shadows seem alive. The ordinary sounds of London, the clatter of horse-drawn carts, the low murmur of conversation, the creak of floorboards, were now filtered through fear and imagination, each amplified by the collective tension of the neighborhood. The East End, usually resilient and vibrant, had become a stage for uncertainty, suspicion, and the subtle manipulation of perception by grief, rumor, and something more intangible, the local newspapers. While sparse in detail reflected the growing fascination and dread, articles hinted at the tragedy, emphasizing the mysterious circumstances of the child's death, yet never revealed concrete evidence or clear explanation. The press coverage fueled speculation and a lingering anxiety, giving rise to dark rumors that spread faster than any official report. Londoners who had never visited the East End felt the unease in the words printed on the page, imagining the fog-laden streets, the shadowed alleys, and the faint, inexplicable melodies that accompanied them. Each household seemed to interpret the events differently. Some believed the child's spirit remained, seeking attention or justice. Others assumed a natural psychological explanation, the city's collective grief manifesting as auditory hallucinations. Yet even skeptics could not deny the tangible shift in atmosphere. Doors that were once left ajar now stayed tightly closed. Candlelight flickered in odd patterns, and unaccountable chills ran through the bones of those who walked the streets at night. People found themselves listening for sounds that might not exist, straining their ears in silence for the faintest whisper of a song or a shadow of movement. Every day reinforced the belief that the child's death had left an imprint on the very environment of the neighborhood. An invisible but palpable presence that altered behavior, perception, and mood. The crypt where she was laid to rest became a quiet focal point of curiosity and fear. Visitors left small tokens of remembrance, flowers, trinkets, or handwritten notes, yet some reported these offerings vanished or shifted without explanation. Candles were found extinguished despite no drafts, shadows stretched across walls in impossible patterns, and occasionally, the faint melody would rise, seemingly emanating from the coffin itself. Some described the song as sorrowful, others as hauntingly cheerful, a paradox that deepened the mystique and heightened anxiety. Priests and parishioners alike felt a weight when entering the church, a sensation as though the child's presence watched and measured them silently, judging the living with a quiet persistence. The social fabric of the neighborhood adjusted subtly but significantly. Children grew cautious, playtime shortened, and conversations often turned to whispered speculation. Adults altered routines, avoided certain streets, and treated shadows with more suspicion. The ordinary cadence of life was replaced by a rhythm dictated by fear, superstition, and the insistence of something unseen. Families who had once trusted one another now eyed neighbors warily, wondering who might know more or who might have been involved in the tragedy. Rumors intertwined with fact, until it became nearly impossible to separate truth from imagination. Those with artistic or literary tendencies were drawn to the phenomenon, sketching shadowed alleyways, writing poems about the child's song, or documenting accounts in journals that would later become sources for historians and folklorists. Each new record contributed to the layered, complex tapestry of memory and myth surrounding the event. Even long after the initial tragedy, the stories continued to circulate, shaping the collective memory of the East End and contributing to the haunting aura that enveloped the area. The child's presence, whether real or imagined, had transformed ordinary streets and homes into a living testament to the impact of untimely death and the persistence of grief and fear. In this environment, the boundary between life and death, reality and imagination became blurred. Residents spoke cautiously of what they saw and heard, aware that disbelief could be dangerous in a social sense, and yet unable to fully reconcile what they experienced with reason. The tragedy of the child and the subsequent accounts of her haunting song became a defining feature of the East End in 1914, a marker of collective unease and a symbol of the fragility of innocence. Every shadow, every whisper, every faint note of a melody in the fog reinforced the idea that the city itself had absorbed the child's presence, embedding it into streets, buildings, and the consciousness of all who walked them. Rumors began to spread through London's East End like wildfire, twisting and growing with every retelling. Residents spoke in hushed tones about fleeting glimpses of a small figure wandering near the churchyard, a melody that seemed to drift from nowhere, and shadows that moved against the natural flow of light. Each story carried with it an undertone of dread, a sense that the child's presence was no longer confined to the crypt, but had extended into the streets themselves. Children whispered to one another about hearing her voice in empty rooms, while adults reported unexplained chills that settled over them during routine chores. The more people spoke, the more real the presence became, until even skeptics found themselves questioning the limits of reality. Those who attempted to rationalize the occurrences were confronted with evidence that defied explanation. Windows would creak without wind, floorboards groaned in empty houses, and at times the faint strains of a song would rise in perfect clarity, only to vanish as suddenly as it had appeared. The melody was said to be at once innocent and chilling, a sound that tugged at the heart while stirring an instinctive fear deep in the chest. Residents began to alter their routines, avoiding the streets at dusk, double-locking doors, and keeping children close at all times. The ordinary patterns of life were disrupted as the city became a stage for the unseen, and every fog-shrouded corner carried the possibility of encountering the inexplicable. The child's coffin had long been placed within the church crypt, but the stories suggested her presence had become unbound. Those who visited the site reported a shifting temperature, a pressure in the air, and a sensation of being watched. Candles flickered in ways that seemed intentional, shadows curved in patterns that hinted at deliberate movement, and every sound was amplified by the silence of the surrounding streets. The church became a locus of fascination, fear, and subtle obsession. Locals left small tokens at the crypt, believing that offerings could soothe the spirit or perhaps offer protection from its lingering influence. Yet even these acts seemed to feed the child's presence, giving it shape and substance in the perception of those who interacted with it. The atmosphere of the East End became increasingly tense, and the city's psychological landscape shifted under the weight of collective unease. Shopkeepers reported a decline in evening trade as customers hurried past the neighborhood, fearful of shadows that might conceal the child's form. Families altered routines, meals were taken earlier, and the community became acutely aware of the sounds and movements of their surroundings. Each echo, each rustle of fabric or paper, became a potential manifestation of the haunting. Conversations often turned to whispers, and every tale seemed to enhance the legend, drawing in more attention, more speculation, and more dread. Outside observers, journalists, and historians alike noted the peculiar transformation of the neighborhood. Where once the East End had been bustling and noisy, it now carried a somber, almost reverent stillness. Every corner seemed to hold a story, every alley a secret, and every lamppost cast elongated shadows that invited the imagination to fill in the gaps. Visitors sometimes reported feeling watched or followed, yet when they turned, no one was there. The child's presence, real or imagined, had begun to impose its rhythm on the daily life of the district, merging with the fog, the cold, and the stone structures to create a sense of persistent, subtle terror. The rumors extended beyond local boundaries, reaching those in central London and eventually circulating among communities who had no direct connection to the East End. Letters and newspaper mentions carried the tale further, each retelling amplifying the mystery, the fear, and the sense of inevitability surrounding the child's story. It became a phenomenon both psychological and cultural, a case study in how tragedy and myth could intertwine, creating a narrative that escaped reason, yet demanded acknowledgement. Individuals who sought to investigate personally often found themselves unsettled by the smallest details. Footsteps in empty corridors, sudden chills, and glimpses of movement in the periphery of vision forced even the most logical to pause. Their reports, though skeptical in tone, inadvertently added credibility to the legend, reinforcing the belief that something inexplicable had taken root in the city. Families avoided certain streets after dark, windows were tightly shuttered, and many households refrained from discussing the events openly, fearing that attention might provoke the unknown. The child's voice, as reported, was sometimes faint, sometimes unnervingly clear, but it never failed to draw attention, binding all who heard it into a shared yet unsettling experience. Each day that passed strengthened the sense that the neighborhood had been altered irreversibly. Normal life continued in mechanical fashion, yet an underlying current of dread influenced every action. The child's death had not only left a physical absence, but had created a psychological presence that seeped into the collective consciousness. Shadows, wind, and fog became accomplices in the experience, shaping perceptions, heightening anxiety, and ensuring that no one could ignore the lingering effect of what had transpired. The ordinary rhythms of work, play, and conversation were punctuated by awareness of the unseen, each note of the haunting melody serving as a reminder that the child's story extended beyond mortality and had claimed a portion of London itself. The culmination of these tensions led to subtle but perceptible changes in behavior and routine. Residents reported insomnia, heightened nervousness, and an inability to concentrate, all attributed to the pervasive awareness of the haunting. Even those who did not believe in supernatural explanations found themselves acting as if under observation, their actions constrained by an invisible force that dictated the tempo of daily life. In this way, the child's death and her continued presence, real or imagined, reshaped the very environment of the East End, leaving it suspended between normality and nightmare, a place where shadows whispered, streets hummed, and the melody of a child who no longer lived threaded through every corner of the neighborhood. The fog seemed thicker at night, curling through the narrow lanes like a living thing, carrying with it the faint, chilling melody that had become synonymous with the child's presence. Residents spoke of sounds that seemed to originate from impossible places, a voice rising from rooftops, alleyways, or even the interiors of homes where no one slept. Each report heightened the sense of dread, turning routine walks into cautious journeys and familiar streets into corridors of suspicion. Families barred doors and windows long before dusk, and children huddled indoors afraid to step outside, their play replaced by whispered conversations about the child who sang from her coffin. Those brave or curious enough to venture near the churchyard at night described a profound, almost physical tension in the air. The mist seemed to press in on them, carrying the faint notes of the child's song, and the shadows stretched and shifted in ways that defied the eye. Some claimed the tune could coax tears, while others found it unbearable, filling them with a mixture of sorrow and terror. The sensation was visceral, leaving an imprint that lingered long after the sound faded. Observers from outside the neighborhood began to arrive, drawn by tales in newspapers and word of mouth. Scholars, journalists, and even opportunistic thrill-seekers came to witness the phenomena, but few could explain what they experienced. Footsteps were heard where no one walked, shadows moved against logic, and the melody rose and fell with a deliberate, almost sentient quality. Even rational minds struggled to reconcile the evidence with explanation, and many left with a sense of unease that lingered for days. The East End became a theater of the uncanny, a place where ordinary life was overlaid with a persistent layer of fear and fascination. The tension seeped into the very fabric of the community. Daily routines became ritualized, with residents timing their activities to avoid exposure to the sounds or shadows. Shops opened later and closed earlier, markets were visited only during daylight, and families avoided streets associated with sightings or melodic whispers. Even the authorities approached the area cautiously, wary of the inexplicable reports and the effect the neighborhood's reputation had on social behavior. Despite investigations, no concrete evidence emerged, leaving the stories to grow unchecked, fueled by imagination, fear, and the persistent presence that haunted the streets. The church and its crypt became a magnet for attention, curiosity, and superstition. Parishioners reported new unsettling phenomena: candles extinguished spontaneously, faint music echoing during services, and a pervasive feeling of being observed. Offerings left at the crypt were sometimes found moved or missing, heightening the sense that the child's influence extended beyond the physical realm. The building itself seemed altered, shadows stretching in unnatural directions, the air heavy with anticipation or warning. Even those who attempted rational explanations struggled to account for the combination of tangible and intangible experiences that defined the space. Visitors often left with a profound sense of discomfort, claiming a lingering pressure on the chest, a shiver that could not be attributed to cold, and the haunting impression that the child's gaze followed them even as they departed. The phenomena became a topic of conversation, a symbol of the fragile boundary between life and death, reality and imagination, and a chilling testament to the consequences of unresolved violence. In homes throughout the neighborhood, ordinary sounds were interpreted as signals of presence. The creak of a floorboard, the distant rattle of a cart, even the flutter of curtains in the wind. The child's story had become inseparable from the environment, a haunting interwoven into daily life that could not be ignored. The psychological impact grew more pronounced with each passing day. Residents reported disturbed sleep, increased irritability, and a sense of being perpetually watched. Children refused to enter certain rooms. Adults avoided specific streets, and social interactions were often colored by fear of provoking unseen forces. Attempts at rational explanation were undermined by the consistency and persistence of experiences, as if the city itself had absorbed the memory and influence of the child's death. Every creaking door, flickering lamp, or distant note of music reinforced the perception of a presence that was both sorrowful and demanding of attention. Through whispered accounts and observational notes, the story expanded into a legend that enveloped the neighborhood. Even those who had no direct experience internalized the tale, adjusting behavior and expectations accordingly. The child's death had not merely ended a life, it had transformed the environment, instilling an enduring sense of vigilance, superstition, and awe. Streets, alleys, and homes became vessels for a haunting that was simultaneously intimate and overwhelming, and no resident could escape its subtle influence. The cumulative effect was a neighborhood suspended between ordinary life and perpetual alertness. Work continued, play continued, yet every action was tempered by the unseen and the unheard. The fog, shadows, and distant hums of the child's song threaded through daily existence, linking every resident to a shared experience of fear, sorrow, and fascination. The build-up to the inevitable confrontation with the truth of her presence, whether real or imagined, intensified with every passing hour, setting the stage for the shocking climax that would define the story for generations to come. The night the truth began to reveal itself was colder than any the city had endured that winter. The fog clung like a living entity to the narrow lanes, and every street lamp flickered as if uncertain of its purpose. In the East End, silence had fallen over the neighborhood in anticipation, a suffocating quiet that made each heartbeat loud and each footstep a potential warning. Residents huddled behind bolted doors and shuttered windows. Yet from the alleys and empty streets came a sound so unmistakable it could not be ignored. The child's voice, clear and melodic, drifting through the air with a chilling insistence. Those who heard it reported a tremor that ran from head to toe, a combination of grief, fear, and fascination that made them incapable of looking away or turning from the sound. It was as though the city itself was holding a breath, poised for an event that would blur the boundaries between life and death. The authorities, who had long dismissed reports as imagination or coincidence, were forced to confront the inexplicable. Police patrols moving cautiously through the fog encountered shadows that did not match the movements of any human figure. Doors opened and closed without contact, and in one instance a faint, ethereal singing rose from an empty church courtyard, compelling even hardened officers to halt in their tracks. The effect was immediate and profound. Whispers of the child's presence intensified, and a sense of collective dread spread throughout the neighborhood. Witnesses described the song as both comforting and macabre, each note a contradiction that teased the mind and chilled the soul. The crypt, already a focal point of superstition and fear, became central to the unfolding events. Candles that had burned for months suddenly went out without wind. Shadows within the stone walls shifted with a will of their own, and a faint mist began to rise from the ground, curling around the coffin as if drawn by an unseen force. Locals who dared approach spoke of an overwhelming presence, a sensation of eyes upon them, and the unmistakable sound of a child singing in intervals too precise and melodic to be accidental. Some claimed that the melody carried words, phrases impossible to interpret, but their effect was undeniable, a tug at the heart and a chilling reminder of mortality and innocence lost. Those brave enough to document the events attempted to do so with caution. Notebooks filled with trembling accounts, sketches of shadows, and attempts to transcribe the melody became part of the growing archive of the inexplicable. Yet every entry seemed to invite further occurrences, as if the act of observation amplified the child's presence. Doors banged, floorboards creaked, and faint whispers accompanied the written notes, reinforcing the idea that her influence extended beyond the mere sound of singing. The atmosphere of dread deepened, and those involved began to fear that the line separating reality from the supernatural had dissolved. Each evening, the neighborhood became a theater of tension. Residents reported seeing figures darting across rooftops, hearing footsteps echoing along alleys that were otherwise empty, and glimpsing fleeting shapes in the fog that bore the unmistakable form of a child. The effect was cumulative, a psychological and emotional buildup that reached a breaking point when multiple witnesses converged near the crypt, each experiencing phenomena that confirmed the stories were not isolated. The presence was undeniable, tangible in ways that defied explanation, and a sense of inevitability settled over those gathered. The child's song had become a force, an entity intertwined with the city, demanding recognition, observation, and perhaps reckoning. The stories of the day grew darker as personal accounts emerged. Residents claimed objects moved with intention, shadows stretched to follow, and the air itself seemed to pulse with an unseen energy. Those who had been skeptical found themselves unsettled, unable to rationalize the occurrences and compelled to alter behavior, avoid streets, and huddle indoors. Fear became a shared currency, binding the community in a collective anticipation of what might happen next. Even the clergy reported moments when sermons faltered, candles extinguished spontaneously, and an oppressive sensation of being watched gripped the sanctuary. The child's voice was the silent orchestrator, a melody that manipulated perception, heightened awareness, and forced the living to confront the presence of what had been taken too soon. The climax was not sudden, but a crescendo of tension that had been building for weeks. Each reported sighting, each whispered melody, each shadow that seemed to move independently, contributed to a collective understanding that the child's presence was not merely anecdotal, but an active force within the neighborhood. The culmination of these events reached a moment when multiple residents, drawn simultaneously toward the churchyard, experienced phenomena that could no longer be dismissed. The air vibrated with the song, shadows moved with intent, and the fog itself seemed to pulse and twist around them, creating an atmosphere so dense with fear and fascination that the mind struggled to separate imagination from reality. As the fog thickened, the crypt seemed to breathe with an unnatural life, the shadows within elongating and contracting with deliberate rhythm. Witnesses described a sensation of pressure in the chest, a weight that made breathing laborious, as if the air itself had been infused with the child's presence. The faint melody swelled unexpectedly, filling the courtyard with notes that seemed to resonate directly within the minds of those present. Some wept uncontrollably, overcome with grief and fear, while others felt paralyzed, unable to turn away or flee from the unfolding phenomenon. The child's song, once a distant whisper, now commanded the environment, weaving through stone, fog, and flesh with an undeniable force. Local authorities, having accompanied the witnesses to ensure order, found themselves confounded. Every instrument of measurement, thermometers, clocks, even compasses, seemed to behave erratically, and the temperature fluctuated without pattern, creating a sense of disorientation. Officers reported seeing flickering shadows coalesce into the vague form of a child, only to dissolve moments later. The fog carried the melody in impossible directions, passing through walls and down streets with no clear source, confirming that the phenomenon was neither auditory illusion nor trick of the wind. The effect was cumulative, reinforcing the notion that the child's presence had become an active participant in reality, capable of manipulating perception, space, and emotion simultaneously. As observers strained to comprehend the events, the song reached an almost unbearable clarity. Notes that had once been faint and ethereal now rang with a precision that seemed both innocent and horrific. Some claimed the melody contained messages, untranslatable yet profoundly affecting, each phrase igniting a spectrum of sorrow, fear, and fascination. The emotional intensity of the moment created a shared experience, a collective consciousness of dread and wonder that bound everyone in the courtyard together, yet left each individual profoundly isolated within their own perception of the haunting. Parishioners and residents alike recounted sensations of being physically drawn toward the crypt, as if invisible hands guided them, compelling closer observation. Candles extinguished spontaneously, shadows shifted unpredictably, and the fog pulsed in time with the melody, creating an environment where natural law seemed suspended. Those present reported auditory hallucinations, feeling the child's voice echoing within their minds even after leaving the site. The events reached a crescendo when a faint, almost imperceptible laughter accompanied the final notes of the melody, a sound both tender and macabre, leaving an imprint on all who heard it. The crypt became not merely a resting place for the deceased, but an epicenter of inexplicable phenomena that resisted logical explanation. The community's response evolved rapidly. Rumors spread of miraculous and terrifying occurrences, of personal encounters with the presence that left individuals emotionally and physically shaken. Homes were further fortified, streets patrolled with a combination of caution and fear, and religious ceremonies incorporated prayers for protection or appeasement. The child's influence had penetrated both private and communal life, altering behaviors, perceptions, and expectations across the neighborhood. Even those previously skeptical found themselves constrained by an invisible authority, responding to the unseen with heightened vigilance, superstition, and reverence. Observers who documented the events created records that would later perplex historians, psychologists, and folklorists alike. Sketches depicted fog-laden streets, fleeting shadows, and attempts to capture the form of the child in visual notes. Written accounts described the musical qualities of the haunting, the precise intervals, and the emotional effect, often emphasizing the impossibility of explaining the phenomena through conventional means. Each attempt at analysis seemed to magnify the intensity, as if acknowledging the presence validated its influence and expanded its reach. Through the night, the events continued in cycles. The melody would swell and fade, shadows would move and pause, and the fog would shift, maintaining a continuous tension that prevented anyone from relaxing or feeling safe. The boundary between observer and observed blurred. Residents became participants in an unending drama that demanded attention, respect, and above all caution. Even mundane elements of the environment, lampposts, fences, doorways seemed imbued with the same supernatural resonance, carrying fragments of the child's presence and ensuring that every movement through the neighborhood became an encounter with the uncanny. At dawn, when the first pale light struggled through the dense fog, the courtyard appeared deceptively calm, yet those who remained could feel the aftermath, an invisible residue of energy that clung to skin, hair, and clothes. The experience had been collective yet intensely personal, leaving impressions that would haunt every participant for the remainder of their lives. Conversations were hushed, expressions wary, and the psychological impact profound. London's East End had been irrevocably transformed. Its streets, alleys, and homes now contained traces of an event that defied rational explanation and would continue to shape behavior, myth, and memory for years to come. The child's song, the fog, and the crypt had merged into a single, indelible tableau of fear, fascination, and sorrow, marking the climax of a phenomenon that would persist long after the witnesses departed. The morning after the climax, London's East End felt different, though to the casual observer nothing had changed. Residents, however, could sense an invisible weight hanging over the streets, a residue of the night's events that pressed against skin, thoughts, and hearts. Doors were still bolted, windows shuttered, and children remained indoors, their usual play replaced by cautious observation. Even those who had not witnessed the full extent of the haunting felt its echo, a subtle tension that made ordinary tasks feel monumental and every passing shadow suspect. Whispers of what had occurred spread quietly but quickly, reinforcing a collective understanding that something extraordinary had unfolded, an event that could not be ignored or explained. The authorities attempted to document the incidents, but their efforts were met with confusion, frustration, and in some cases fear. Officers' notes described the fog, shadows, and melody, but each report seemed to defy logic, leaving investigators unsure of how to proceed. Some claimed to feel an invisible presence while taking statements, and several noted that their instruments behaved erratically, compasses spinning and thermometers fluctuating without cause. The crypt, which had been a point of focus during the climax, was now approached with reverence, fear, and trepidation. Candles left burning days earlier were extinguished inexplicably, and offerings from visitors, flowers, trinkets, notes had shifted position or vanished entirely, suggesting that the child's presence persisted even in absence of an audience. Residents adjusted to life with an altered sense of reality. Ordinary sounds, the creak of floorboards, distant carts, whispers of wind were interpreted as signals or echoes of the haunting. Fear became a shared experience, a silent language that guided behavior and decision-making. Families coordinated schedules to avoid encounters, shops and markets adjusted hours, and social interactions carried a subtle tension. The child's presence, whether spirit, memory, or manifestation, had woven itself into the fabric of daily life, creating an environment where rationality and superstition coexisted uneasily. Visitors who came after the events reported a mixture of awe and terror. Scholars, journalists, and the merely curious entered the neighborhood hoping to witness the phenomena firsthand, yet many left unnerved, unable to rationalize the experiences. Shadows seemed to move with intent. Fog curled unpredictably, and the faint melody sometimes arose without warning, untraceable in source but unmistakable in effect. Accounts described a collective consciousness of unease, a shared understanding that the child's influence was pervasive and persistent. Even attempts to leave notes or record evidence often resulted in inexplicable alterations. Ink smudged, paper torn, recordings distorted, reinforcing the belief that the phenomenon could manipulate perception, matter, and memory simultaneously. The church and crypt became central to local ritual and superstition. Parishioners continued services with heightened caution, candles were treated as sacred and fragile, and offerings were left with reverent care. The crypt, though unchanging physically, was understood to be a site of ongoing activity, a focal point where the child's presence manifested with clarity and purpose. Stories of faint singing, shifting shadows, and temperature anomalies persisted, each retelling layering new detail and deepening the collective awareness. Even casual observers acknowledged a subtle energy in the space, a weight that demanded acknowledgement and respect. Over time, the impact extended beyond immediate neighborhoods. Word of the events reached wider London, influencing perceptions, behavior, and cultural memory. Journalists, historians, and folklorists chronicled accounts, weaving them into narratives of mystery, fear, and fascination. The child's story became a cautionary tale and a topic of inquiry, blending fact, rumor, and myth into a tapestry that was difficult to untangle. Letters, sketches, and manuscripts preserved the details, though each added layer seemed to amplify the aura surrounding the events rather than clarify them. Those who had witnessed the climax firsthand were marked by the experience. Emotional and psychological effects were profound. Sleeplessness, heightened vigilance, and an acute awareness of the environment persisted. The ordinary boundaries of reality were questioned, and even mundane events, shifting shadows, distant notes, fog rolling through streets, were now interpreted as signs of continued presence. Families remained close to one another, social gatherings took on a cautious tone, and neighborhood dynamics were defined by the shared experience of the haunting. Even in daylight, a sense of anticipation lingered, awaiting for the phenomenon to manifest again, though never in predictable ways. The city's perception of the East End transformed. Where once the neighborhood had been known for its industry, crowded streets, and resilient communities, it now carried a reputation for the supernatural. Visitors approached with trepidation, rumors circulated with intensity, and the legend of the child who sang from her coffin became embedded in cultural consciousness. Local shops sold trinkets and offerings, often referencing the haunting indirectly, and storytellers wove the events into cautionary tales that were shared orally, preserving the memory while reinforcing the sense of unease. Residents became both participants and witnesses, their lives interwoven with the persistent, intangible presence of the child. As weeks turned into months, the neighborhood settled into a fragile routine, yet the presence of the child lingered like a silent observer. Residents adapted, though the tension never fully dissipated. Windows remained tightly closed, doors bolted, and children were watched more closely than ever. The ordinary rhythms of life continued outwardly, but an invisible undercurrent of fear persisted, shaping behaviors, interactions, and perceptions. Even the fog, once a natural feature of the East End, seemed imbued with intent, curling around buildings and alleys as though the city itself remembered the events and the melody that had filled the night. Observers noted subtle changes in weather and atmosphere. The fog rolled more densely along certain streets, shadows lengthened in unexpected patterns, and the air often carried a faint melody that could not be traced to any human source. Those who had once been skeptical found themselves wary, their daily routines now dictated by a mixture of superstition and cautious observation. The child's presence had become a constant companion, a force woven into the fabric of the environment, influencing mood, behavior, and perception without direct interaction. Local merchants reported reduced evening trade, families adjusted mealtimes, and the streets seemed quieter, heavier, as if the city itself bore the weight of the unresolved tragedy. The church, long a point of reverence and fear, continued to serve as a focal point for communal attention. Parishioners maintained a careful routine, offering candles, prayers, and tokens, yet many reported that the crypt itself remained an active locus of influence. Shadows continued to move in unusual patterns, faint melodies rose and faded unpredictably, and the temperature often shifted without apparent cause. The structure, while physically unchanged, had become a conduit for the child's presence, a space where the boundaries of life and death, reality and perception, remained blurred. Even those who had never witnessed the climactic events felt its effect, their understanding of the neighborhood shaped by accounts, rumors, and the persistent, subtle reminders of the haunting. The social dynamics of the East End evolved in response. Communities became more insular, protective, and vigilant, monitoring neighbors and children alike. Conversations often carried a subdued tone, and ordinary disputes were tempered by a shared awareness of the unexplained. The child's story, transmitted orally and through letters, grew in richness and detail, layering fact, speculation, and myth into a collective consciousness that shaped behavior and expectation. Fear and fascination intertwined, producing a community that was both resilient and acutely aware of forces beyond comprehension. Visitors, scholars, and journalists who arrived months after the initial events found a neighborhood transformed. Streets were quieter, homes more fortified, and an air of tense vigilance prevailed. Reports of shadows, melodic whispers, and subtle shifts in temperature were common, reinforcing the idea that the child's presence was not a singular incident, but an ongoing influence. Documentation attempted to capture the phenomena, but every record seemed to carry the residue of the experience, amplifying both curiosity and dread. Letters, sketches, and journals preserved the narrative, while simultaneously enhancing its legend. The psychological and emotional effects on residents were profound and enduring. Insomnia, anxiety, and hypervigilance were commonly reported. Children remained wary of certain rooms and streets. Adults approached daily life with heightened caution, and social interactions were conducted under the silent understanding of potential unseen observation. The child's presence had transcended physical boundaries, becoming an invisible force that shaped perception and dictated behavior without physical intervention. Every rustle of wind, flicker of candlelight, or faint note of music was interpreted as an interaction with the lingering presence, reinforcing the perception that the neighborhood itself was haunted. Over time, the events became codified in local lore and cultural memory. The child's story was recounted in schools, shared during community gatherings, and referenced in newspapers and literary works. Sketches, journals, and accounts preserved the phenomenon, creating a layered record that would intrigue scholars and frighten future generations. The East End, physically unchanged, had been transformed psychologically and emotionally, its residents bound by a shared experience of grief, fear, and fascination. The child who sang from her coffin had left a permanent imprint, a haunting melody threaded into the street's buildings and consciousness of those who lived there, ensuring that the tragedy and its aftermath would be remembered long after the events themselves faded from immediate memory. The haunting was not just a memory, but a living force. Visitors described sensations of being watched, faint music echoing from unseen sources, and shadows moving independently of natural light. These phenomena persisted for years, suggesting that the child's presence had become an enduring part of the environment, a spectral observer intertwined with the city itself. Families adapted, rituals evolved, and the community learned to coexist with a presence that refused to fade. The child's story, while tragic, had become a defining feature of the East End, an indelible mark on the collective consciousness and a reminder that the line between life and death, reality and perception, could be crossed, leaving echoes that persisted long after the initial tragedy. Despite months passing since the climax, the true nature of the child's presence remained elusive, shrouded in uncertainty and speculation. Experts and witnesses alike struggled to reconcile the phenomenon with reason, science, or faith. The melody, shadows, and inexplicable movements persisted without pattern, source, or explanation, leaving all who encountered them in a constant state of unease. Attempts to measure or record the events often yielded distorted results. Sound recordings would capture nothing. Photographs revealed anomalies only under certain conditions, and instruments behaved erratically, defying logic. The persistence of these phenomena suggested something beyond conventional understanding, a force or consciousness that existed outside the boundaries of ordinary perception. The crypt remained central to the mystery. Candlelight flickered without drafts, shadows stretched unnaturally, and faint melodies emerged at random, sometimes audible only to a single person and other times filling entire courtyards. The child's influence seemed to defy space, penetrating walls, streets, and alleys with equal force. Residents began to speak of a presence that was patient, deliberate, and inescapable, capable of interacting with the environment and the people within it without physical contact. Even skeptics could not ignore the repeated, consistent manifestations that seemed orchestrated with intent. Parishioners who entered the church often felt a profound sense of observation, as if the child's consciousness lingered in the air, measuring, judging, or simply observing. Attempts to rationalize the events as coincidence, psychological suggestion, or superstition were undermined by the consistency and precision of experiences. Shadows moved against natural light. Melodies arose from impossible sources, and objects shifted without explanation, creating a scenario where ordinary explanation seemed inadequate. The neighborhood itself had become a stage for a phenomenon that challenged understanding and demanded attention. Outside investigators and scholars attempted to analyze the events scientifically. Instruments were deployed to measure sound, light, and temperature. Logs were kept of all reported occurrences, and attempts were made to isolate variables. Yet every experiment produced anomalies that could not be explained. Microphones failed to capture the faint melodies, thermometers swung erratically, and cameras produced distorted or missing images. Each attempt to impose order on the mystery seemed to intensify it, suggesting a phenomenon that interacted with observation itself. The more attention paid, the stronger, more insistent, and more complex the manifestations became. The psychological effects on residents were compounded by the mystery. Sleep disturbances, heightened vigilance, and acute awareness of environmental details persisted. Even normal sounds, floorboards creaking, wind against windows, distant carts, were interpreted as signs of the presence. Children avoided specific rooms or streets, while adults modified behavior based on intuition and subtle cues, a constant adaptation to a force that could not be directly confronted or comprehended. The neighborhood existed in a liminal state, a space between the known and unknown, haunted not only by the child's death but by the persistence of her inexplicable influence. Legends grew alongside observation. Oral histories described sightings of a shadowed child, melodies that induced tears or fear, and interactions that could not be rationally explained. These narratives, layered over months and years, reinforced the perception of a presence that was both historical and ongoing, a haunting rooted in reality, yet extending beyond it. Each retelling added detail, nuance, and emotional weight, making the mystery an active, evolving part of communal memory. Individuals attempting direct interaction reported experiences that bordered on the supernatural. Approaching the crypt at night often induced nausea, vertigo, or an overwhelming sense of being watched. Candles extinguished spontaneously, shadows aligned with the movement of individuals, and the faint melody would crescendo or fade in response to attention. Such experiences suggested that the child's presence possessed awareness, intention, and possibly a form of consciousness that could engage selectively with observers. Even indirect attention seemed sufficient to trigger manifestations, indicating a force beyond ordinary understanding. The city's broader perception of the East End adapted to the mystery. Londoners spoke cautiously of the area, newspapers documented unusual occurrences, and scholars began treating the phenomenon as a subject worthy of study. Rumors, personal accounts, and anecdotal evidence merged with attempts at rational explanation, creating a layered narrative where fact, myth, and psychology were intertwined. The mystery became both a local and cultural phenomenon, shaping identity, behavior, and collective consciousness. Visitors and residents alike described a palpable tension, a feeling that the neighborhood itself had been marked by the events. Streets, alleys, and buildings carried the residue of the phenomenon, influencing perception even when no direct interaction occurred. Ordinary life continued, yet awareness of the child's presence, her melody, her shadows, her influence persisted as an unshakable undercurrent. The mystery endured, resilient, adaptive, and impossible to fully define, ensuring that the story would continue to intrigue, terrify, and captivate for generations. Over time, attempts to fully understand the child's presence became almost ritualistic, yet no theory sufficed. Scientists, psychologists, and spiritual leaders alike could only speculate. The melody, audible only in fragments and often without clear origin, defied acoustic explanation. Shadows moved contrary to natural light. Objects shifted without physical interference, and the crypt remained a focal point for unexplainable energy. Those who spent prolonged periods within the neighborhood reported sensations of being observed even when alone, a persistent awareness that seemed impossible to shake. The mystery had become an invisible layer of the environment, shaping perception and behavior across the community. Residents developed strategies to cope. Some avoided the crypt entirely, while others approached with offerings, prayers, or silent acknowledgement, believing such acts might appease or interact with the presence. Children were instructed never to linger outdoors after dusk, and adults coordinated routines to minimize exposure to anomalous phenomena. Even with these precautions, the child's influence remained undeniable, manifesting sporadically and unpredictably. The neighborhood had adapted, but it remained fundamentally altered, defined by a constant interplay between ordinary life and the unseen force that haunted it. Legends surrounding the events expanded. Every encounter, whether fleeting or prolonged, was retold with new detail, each account layering upon previous ones to create a dense narrative of fear, sorrow, and fascination. Scholars documented the patterns, yet the phenomena resisted categorization. The child's presence seemed adaptive, responding to attention, observation, and perhaps even belief itself. Accounts emphasized the subtle manipulation of perception, the faint tug of melody, the shifting shadows, the inexplicable movement of objects, all contributing to a sense that reality itself had been altered. Visitors, both local and foreign, described the neighborhood as a liminal space, suspended between history and haunting. Shadows lengthened unnaturally, fog appeared with greater intensity along certain streets, and the faint disembodied melody sometimes echoed through the alleys with clarity that defied explanation. Individuals experienced a profound psychological impact, a sense that the child's consciousness had become entwined with the environment. Rational minds were challenged, and those inclined toward skepticism found their assumptions questioned by the consistency, precision, and persistence of the events. The crypt remained central, a nexus of phenomena and attention. Candles flickered with unseen intention, shadows moved with a deliberateness that suggested awareness, and the melody arose and faded according to unknown rules. Those entering often reported disorientation, vertigo, and emotional disturbance, reinforcing the idea that the child's influence was active, intelligent, and persistent. Even indirect observation seemed sufficient to trigger manifestations, ensuring that the phenomena could not be ignored or rationalized away. Through repeated observation, the community recognized a pattern of interaction that was subtle yet undeniable. Every unusual sound, every moving shadow, every inexplicable flicker of light was interpreted as part of a continuing dialogue with the presence. While no direct communication occurred, the cumulative effect was unmistakable. The child's influence persisted, shaping perception, altering behavior, and leaving a permanent mark on the neighborhood. The phenomena had become woven into the very identity of the East End, an inseparable layer of reality that could not be dismissed or forgotten. The psychological legacy was profound. Residents described heightened awareness, anxiety, and a constant vigilance that persisted across years. Children grew up under the shadow of the phenomenon, learning caution, superstition, and respect for the unseen. Adults adapted routines, modified social behavior, and internalized the narrative of the haunting. Even those who never directly witnessed the climax felt its echo, shaped by stories, rumors, and collective memory. The child's presence had transcended physical manifestation, becoming an enduring aspect of communal consciousness. Outside observers continued to document the events, yet each investigation deepened the mystery. Scientific attempts to measure the melody, shadows, or environmental anomalies repeatedly failed or produced inexplicable results. Letters, sketches, and journals captured fragments of the experience, creating a layered record that fascinated, terrified, and confounded in equal measure. The phenomenon persisted as both event and narrative, an enduring enigma that could not be resolved, rationalized, or ignored. It existed as an invisible architecture within the East End, shaping both reality and perception. The enduring question remained: was the child's presence the result of a lingering consciousness, a supernatural anomaly, or a psychological manifestation amplified by tragedy and collective attention? No answer satisfied all witnesses or scholars. The mystery persisted, resilient and adaptive, asserting itself unpredictably and unavoidably. Shadows shifted, melodies arose, and the crypt continued to exert influence over those who approached, ensuring that the story would remain active, dynamic, and haunting. The East End itself had become a living testament to the unresolved, the unknown, and the inescapable. Years passed, yet the memory of that night remained vivid, an unhealed scar on the East End. The child's song had become a legend, whispered in homes, repeated in streets, and immortalized in the stories of those who had lived through the haunting. The crypt, the fog, and the shadows became symbols of a tragedy that refused to fade, a presence woven into the city's very consciousness. Even children born after the events felt the weight of history, sensing the tension in alleys and the faint hum of melodies that seemed to linger in the air. Life continued outwardly unchanged, but the invisible architecture of fear, grief, and fascination persisted, defining existence in ways impossible to ignore. Residents described the haunting as part of daily life, an invisible companion that shaped decisions, perception, and social interaction. Ordinary sounds, floorboards, distant carts, whispers of wind, were interpreted through the lens of the child's presence. Families maintained careful routines, limiting exposure to streets or buildings associated with the crypt. Children were instructed never to linger outdoors after dusk, and even adults moved with an acute awareness that the unseen might be observing. These adaptations became second nature, a silent acknowledgement that the tragedy and its aftermath had permanently altered reality. Visitors and outsiders continued to be drawn to the neighborhood, motivated by curiosity, scholarly interest, or a desire to witness the inexplicable firsthand. Many left unnerved, reporting sensations of observation, inexplicable melodies, and moving shadows. Photographs, recordings, and journals captured fragments, but nothing could fully convey the pervasive sense of the haunting. Each observer left with impressions both personal and collective, adding to the legend and reinforcing the perception that the child's presence was enduring, intelligent, and impossible to dismiss. The crypt remained the focal point of attention. Candlelight flickered unpredictably, shadows shifted with intention, and melodies emerged and receded without apparent source. Even after decades, individuals reported feeling the presence, a force both sorrowful and commanding, asserting itself in ways that defied rational explanation. Attempts to study, document, or rationalize the phenomenon only seemed to reinforce its persistence, as if acknowledgement strengthened the haunting. The child's story, tragedy, and lingering presence had become inseparable from the neighborhood, forming a living narrative that continued to shape behavior, thought, and memory. The psychological imprint on residents was profound and lasting. Sleep disturbances, heightened vigilance, and emotional sensitivity became common. Adults and children alike developed an acute awareness of their surroundings, attuned to every whisper, shadow, and movement. Ordinary life was continually tempered by caution and reverence, a permanent coexistence with an unseen force that demanded recognition. The child's influence transcended physical manifestation, becoming a persistent layer of reality, invisible yet undeniable. Over time, the haunting achieved cultural significance. Stories, letters, and journals were preserved, shared, and studied, creating a layered understanding of the events. Scholars debated the nature of the presence, while local storytellers reinforced the narrative through oral tradition. Every account emphasized the same core elements: shadows, melodies, and the enduring sense of observation. These narratives preserved not only the memory of the tragedy, but also the ongoing influence of the child, ensuring that each generation inherited both story and sensation. Visitors continued to describe a profound, almost spiritual experience, reporting sensations of being watched, music echoing in emptiness, and shadows behaving with apparent intent. Such experiences reinforced the perception that the child's presence was not fleeting or localized, but a permanent, adaptive phenomenon interwoven with the East End. The neighborhood itself had become a living testament to the tragedy, memory, and inexplicable persistence of a lost life. The legend solidified over decades. Families passed down stories of the child who sang from her coffin, of shadows that moved with will, and of melodies that defied explanation. The crypt, fog, and streets became symbols of unresolved sorrow, a reminder that some events leave marks that cannot be erased. While daily life resumed, the invisible undercurrent of fear, fascination, and respect remained, shaping the rhythm of existence in subtle but undeniable ways. The child's presence had transcended death, tragedy, and time, asserting itself as a haunting that would endure indefinitely. Even decades later, the East End bore the invisible scars of the child's presence. New generations grew up hearing stories of the haunting, of shadows that moved without light and melodies that arose from nowhere, embedding fear, reverence, and fascination into everyday life. Scholars, historians, and journalists continued to document the phenomena, yet no explanation satisfied the mystery. Recordings failed to capture the subtle music, photographs distorted the shadows, and instruments malfunctioned, reinforcing the belief that the child's influence transcended ordinary reality. The crypt, once merely a resting place, had become a nexus of enduring energy, a locus where life, death, memory, and the unexplained converged. Individuals who ventured into the neighborhood reported sensations that defied rational understanding. A faint melody would rise unexpectedly. Shadows would twist against natural light, and a sense of observation would press upon them from every direction. Residents learned to interpret these signs, adjusting behavior and perception to coexist with the unseen. The haunting had become a part of daily life, invisible yet undeniable, shaping the environment, culture, and psychology of the community. Even those who had never witnessed the initial events felt its presence, a testament to the persistence and influence of the phenomenon. The city itself seemed marked. Streets, buildings, and alleyways carried subtle cues of the haunting, visible to those sensitive to its influence. Fog rolled in with an unnatural density. Shadows lengthened unpredictably, and the melody sometimes drifted across empty courtyards, as if reminding residents of the past. Life continued outwardly unchanged. Yet the invisible architecture of fear, awe, and sorrow remained, a constant companion to those inhabiting the East End. Observers described a paradoxical sensation, comfort in recognition and terror in proximity, as though the child's presence was simultaneously protective and demanding. The psychological and emotional impact endured across generations. Children learned caution and superstition. Adults internalized vigilance, and the community adapted social behavior to respect an unseen force. Ordinary experiences, walking through streets, opening doors, listening to distant sounds, were filtered through awareness of the haunting. The child's story had become inseparable from the identity of the neighborhood, a persistent narrative that shaped reality and perception alike. The presence was not merely remembered. It was felt, lived, and integrated into the rhythm of life. The crypt remained central, a site of ongoing influence. Candles flickered with subtle intent, shadows moved against expectation, and melodies arose unpredictably. Even indirect observation triggered manifestations, suggesting an awareness and intelligence that could engage selectively. Scholars debated whether the child's consciousness lingered, or whether the events were amplified by collective memory, grief, and superstition. Regardless of explanation, the effect was undeniable. The haunting endured as both event and living presence, woven into the environment and the consciousness of all who entered it. Cultural memory preserved and amplified the phenomenon. Stories, letters, journals, and oral histories reinforced the narrative, layering each retelling with new detail and emotional resonance. The child's presence, though invisible, shaped art, literature, and social behavior, influencing generations. The haunting became a symbol of unresolved tragedy, a reminder of mortality, and a testament to the persistence of memory beyond death. Visitors, residents, and scholars alike approached the East End with caution, reverence, and fascination, acknowledging the enduring power of the child's presence. The final legacy was a neighborhood transformed not physically, but psychologically and spiritually. Streets, alleys, and buildings retained the weight of history and haunting, carrying an invisible resonance that dictated perception and behavior. The child's song, shadows and presence, persisted as a force beyond explanation, memory, or time. Each generation inherited the story, the sensation, and the influence, ensuring that the haunting would endure indefinitely. The East End became a living monument to a tragedy that refused to fade, a spectral narrative interwoven with daily life, memory, and the unexplainable. In the end, the child's song remained, a haunting melody threading through reality, a reminder that some tragedies do not end, and some presences cannot be forgotten.